in different places in the world, all over the place. And she is co-specialty chief editor of Social Movements, Institution and Governance section in the Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems. I'm happy to hear this talk on agroecological transitions and participatory certification. Hannah, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergio, and thank you all of the technical team here at CIMMYT for getting us connected this morning. I'm really happy to share with you some of the research that we've been doing over the last few years on agroecological transitions and participatory certification. So I'd like to acknowledge a whole bunch of people who've contributed to this research. We're working with a group of farmer advocacy organizations in several countries in Latin America, and a number of people who have conducted research, who've developed our digital tool, and who funded the research. So I'd just like to acknowledge that we couldn't have done this without the other members of our team. So first, I'd like to just define, what do I mean by an agroecological transition? Why might we want one of those globally? So an agroecological transition is looking at diversifying agricultural systems to achieve social and ecological justice in response to the negative social and environmental impacts of what has become an industrial agriculture. So our agricultural system today doesn't still feed everybody. We have a lot of food in the world, but lots of food insecurity. Agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. Agriculture is one of our largest contributors to biodiversity loss. Agricultural workers face challenges with job quality and their labor rights. Farmers struggle to achieve a sustainable livelihood. And we see still today lots of land possession and violence as agricultural systems expand. So agroecological transitions are more than sustainable intensification. There's a lot of words that are included in sustainable intensification, in ecological intensification, and climate smart agriculture. Agroecological transitions take instead a food systems approach. So yes, climate smart agriculture, yes, sometimes intensification, yes, understanding agriculture as an ecological process. But when we talk about agroecological transitions, we are going beyond the farm gate to look at the social, the political, the economic, and the ecological dynamics that affect what any individual farm or farm family is able to do. And so this goes all the way from responsible governance of food systems to looking at the aspects of the circular and solidarity economy. It's about the co-creation and sharing of knowledge. It's about increasing diversity, not just in what is grown, but in the social and economic relationships that come out of our food systems. And these are the 10 elements of agroecology that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations have put forward a couple of years ago, and are kind of, a lot of us are kind of working to say, well, what does this look like on the ground? And then just to add to that, in the last few days, I was meeting with a couple of farmer organizations in Tlaxcala, and for them, agroecology, again, is more than just a different way to produce food. For Centro Campesino, it's a dignified, just, and autonomous approach to social, cultural, and economic development. For Tichoca Nipilitsi, it's respect for ancestral knowledge. It's a shared responsibility between the city and the countryside, and the reconstruction of a social fabric. So what do we know about agroecological transitions? Where's the data? This has been a challenge because agroecology is defined in so many different ways. It's very context specific. People who are trying to understand agroecological change have had to look in a lot of different places when we start to do research on agroecological transitions. So we do look at national census and survey data. Often this data is out of date. So most agricultural censuses are done every 5 to 10 years. They're often done, they lack context specificity. So we might not know all of the local ecological, social, cultural, economic variables that might determine particular outcomes. We also have a very rich source of agroecological data in individual studies. So case studies by ecologists, by agronomists, by sociologists, by teams of people in particular places have given us a very close picture of some of these social and ecological dynamics. But these studies are generally not generalizable. They're generally not comparable. They use different methodologies. And these studies are very costly and time consuming for both farmers and researchers. So farmers, tell us, why do you want to ask me this information again? I've already given it to last year's student and the other student and the government and et cetera. So kind of the challenge from these different studies, what do we know about what is holding back agroecological transitions? We know that globally farms are becoming less diverse and larger. Farmers struggle to access and keep their land. The impact of perverse subsidies on homogenizing or challenging the diversification of food systems. There's challenges with farm succession and youth engagement, with access to markets, with training and agroecological certification. So we saw over the last 50 years a real shift in the way that, for example, agricultural training is conducted in technical schools and universities. So there's a serious research need to better understand and address factors supporting agroecological transitions. We see new research programs on agroecology emerging. For example, the FAO has developed a TAPE tool, which is a form of agricultural census more oriented towards agroecological variables. Again, it's a census. It requires a census enumerator to go to a farm and extract the data. But at the same time, agroecological farmers want to see their practices recognized and their outcomes assessed. So agroecological farmers say, we are contributing to ecosystem services, we're contributing to food security, we're contributing to biodiversity conservation. We want a way to share that narrative with the broader public. They want to share it with consumers who are increasingly asking for kind of proof of sustainable farming. Policymakers are interested in understanding the impacts of investing in certain kinds of agricultural systems. And of course, us as researchers, we always want to know what's happening. So for the last several years, we've been trying to sort of think about how to more efficiently capture, analyze, and share data related to agroecology. And the approach we've been taking recently is the hidden data set that is encountered in participatory guarantee and other kinds of organic certification systems. So when farmers seek a certification, whether for organic or agroecology or payments for ecosystem services, or there's many opportunities that farmers are already undergoing where they're collecting data about their own farm and they're sharing that with an organization and sometimes a government. So the International Federation of Organic Movements International has kind of been documenting the really rapid growth globally of what are known as participatory guarantee systems, which are farmer-to-farmer peer certification networks where farmers are defining for themselves what is agroecology or organic. They're sharing data with each other, and then they're using that data to achieve different kinds of certification. So globally, this is 78 countries, 242 known PGS initiatives. This is definitely an underestimate. The ones in Mexico that we work with aren't in the EOFOAM database. So this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. So just as an example, the Rede Ecovida in Brazil is a participatory guarantee network that's been active for about 20 years. It certifies over 5,000 farmers in about four states in Brazil. And it connects farmer groups with peer-to-peer extension and mentoring. It connects farmer groups with cooperative marketing networks. And it also is a certification system that is recognized by the government for local sales and labeling. So that's just one example that we're working with. So all of these networks are having farmers fill out forms. So here's Ecovida's form on the left, one in Paraguay underneath, and one in El Salvador here. These are just a couple of examples. All of these organizations our farmers are filling out data. They're sharing it with their organization. Sometimes that goes to the government. Mostly these farmers aren't keeping their data. So they're filling out a form, or an extension agent is filling it out with them, and that data gets sent off and put in a drawer or, a box. Sometimes a government database in Brazil, but very few of the other ones go all that way. And so we started asking, well, there's a lot of rich information here, and a lot of this information actually is similar across the different certification networks. Many of these groups are asking the same questions. So they're writing this information down in notebooks, in forms, how to capture this. If you have one study and one student, the student might go and photocopy these notebooks and digitize it, very time consuming. How could we scale up the synthesis and analysis of this information? So here's just an example. Farmers are often drawing maps of their farms in these certification documents. So we have started on a project which has been quite exploratory and exciting to look at how we can map agroecological transitions through participatory digital certification. And so I'm going to walk you through kind of the history of that project, the methodology that we're using, and then some of the next steps and lessons learned that we have experienced over the last few years. So I want to just take a pause. There's a lot of concern about digitalization of agriculture. So when we think about the ways in which agricultural data is being used by commercial entities, by governments, a lot of this data is proprietary. It's extracted from farmers. It's used for purposes that farmers may or may not know about. At the same time, many smaller scale, diversified, less resourced farmers say we're being left out of the digital revolution. What is the approach to digital agriculture that protects farmers against surveillance? It's more than just inclusion in an existing system, but maybe a digital agriculture that moves more towards data justice, towards technology sovereignty, and towards creating technologies by and for farmers, with farmers, rather than kind of on top of them. And so we're really trying to stay on the right side here of understanding both the possibilities, but also the challenges and dangers of digitalization if we're approaching this through a data justice, food sovereignty, agroecology lens. So our agroecological indicators pilot, we are working with 8 farmer groups that have been working on agroecological certification for a number of years, and they had already self-organized into what's called a Participatory Guarantee Network, Knowledge Network. So 2 organizations in Mexico, 3 in Brazil, 1 in Paraguay, 1 in El Salvador, 1 in Ecuador. And they collectively are working with 6 certifying bodies. So they have 6 different kind of sets of certification forms. And between 2019 and 2021, we held a number of workshops, both in person in 2019 and 2020, and then increasingly virtually, obviously, 2021, to co-define pre-existing and novel agroecological indicators that either were already a part of their certification systems or they were interested in kind of adding and comparing. So there was a period of sharing among the organizations. What do you care about in your organization? What are you measuring in your organization? And then there was a period of kind of prioritization, which I can show you. And then this year we so starting last year, farmers are starting to send us their data. We did some digitization of their paper forms. And then this year, for the first time, they entered their certification materials in our digital tool, which I'll talk about it in a minute. So as part of our workshops, we spent a lot of time sharing and exchanging different ways of thinking about agroecological indicators. So this is a project that a student of mine did to compare a bunch of existing assessment frameworks, many options of indicators that could be used across a range of areas: soils, water, biodiversity, human health, equity, cultural diversity. We looked at the tape tool and the kind of inputs that had gone into the development of the tape tool. And then we looked at the producers' forms themselves, and we sort of compared, what was similar and different across the different forms. We kind of winnowed these down into a set of indicators that the groups in our pilot were interested in. Again, multiple rounds of voting, both in person and then as we moved into the period of the pandemic, doing online surveys where the farmer groups would take these indicators back to their network, have sometimes face-to-face, sometimes virtual meetings with their own group, and then come back to our steering committee and kind of report back. And apologies, a few of my slides are in Spanish because I've been giving a couple of talks this week, but just, what was our criteria for inclusion? So were the indicators congruent with agroecological values? We used kind of procedural criteria around congruence between values, diversity of indicators. So we wanted to make sure we had kind of some social ones, some economic ones, some ecological ones, control, possession, privacy, and access to data was really important. So we did a lot of discussion about data justice, data sovereignty. How are these data going to be managed? What data were people more willing to share, and what data might need to be kept private? We looked at feasibility. A lot of people are interested in soil microbiology. Is that feasible for a small scale farmer to collect data on their own? Probably not, but qualitative measures of soil health perhaps could be included. We looked for applicability to diverse contexts. So again, many groups are very diverse. And so what is of interest to one group may or may not be of interest to another. So in our first round, we kind of selected indicators that were more commonly of interest across the different groups. And then we also looked at utility. What information are farmers asking for to be returned to them to help them with their on-farm decision-making, or to inform local policy around agriculture, or to guide research on sustainable agriculture. So that was kind of the methodology of figuring out what could be measured, what farmer groups wanted to be measured, what did agroecology mean to them? And then comes the question of, well, how would we do this digitally? So these are the indicators that we kind of studied this year. I'll share some results with you in a minute. So simultaneously, kind of in a different part of my research group, we had been kind of thinking about, again, this problem of certification and record keeping on diversified farms, and really seeing that a lot of the digital tools that were out there were not appropriate for diversified farms, were not appropriate for a lot of the needs that the farmers we were working with had, including in Canada. So this wasn't just a Latin America thing. We work a lot with farmers in Canada and having the same problem. These apps are proprietary, they are costly, they might have a monthly fee, they might have a narrow set of functionality or utility. So when you think about precision agriculture software, farmers don't really get to have that data back. It's very narrow around a few variables like yield and inputs. And so I had a postdoc at the time, CIMMYT, who said, well, let's create an app that is more holistic, that really allows farmers to own their own data, and that could help them track a range of sustainability indicators, including those related to agroecology. And so we tried it out. We had a bunch of computer science students. We had volunteer coders. It's an open access, open source project. So we had a lot of contributors coming in globally saying, we're interested in contributing to a process that makes digital technology more appropriate, more accessible, and more autonomous for small scale diversified farmers. Now that one's sideways. So we come up, again, this process of indicators was going on with our SPG group. We also were having these conversations with other organizations and farmer groups in Canada and in the United States. And we kind of found that, farmers were interested in understanding their cost of production. They were interested in sustainability reporting, and they were interested in data sovereignty. From the research side, we were really interested in data that could help us explore the trade-offs in farming system outcomes, as influenced also by landscape and policy contexts. So really being able to do more spatially explicit analysis. We're interested in the creation of open data products and evidence bases for better decision-making. And we're interested in tracking the resilience of agroecosystems and nutrition in human populations in the face of climate change. So the goals that a lot of us have in the field of sustainable agriculture. So we created a digital tool, much to our surprise. It's been adopted quite widely. So it's only been released for less than 2 years. And we're working, closely with the 7 farmer groups in our pilot. All of the rest of these adoptees have just been independent people who found it on the internet and are trying it out. So what can the app do? You can easily map your farm. So different fields. This is our university demonstration farm at UBC. You can see that we have a large forest area, and then we have a bunch of different fields that are used for different purposes. We've created a crop catalog, which provides a lot of information to the farmer, and farmers can select different crops. They can also add their own crops and their own varieties, which is helping us expand our database. When you create a crop management plan, it generates a series of tasks that then can be tracked for labor, for how long it took. There's some suggested planting specifications, but farmers can modify that according to their local varieties. Again, having, I don't know why this is advancing on its own, tasks that help us understand what people are doing and who's doing it. So different users can log into the same farm. And so you can see some farmers are using this to track payments to farm workers, for example. So assigning tasks to different farm workers, seeing how long it takes, and then that data is accessible to them for their payroll. And then the app provides a series of insights, in real time to farmers about, different aspects of the data that they have entered is kind of processed and shared back with them in real time. Farmers can also upload documents. So many processes of organic certification require farmers to share documents about their input. So this is a place where farmers can store those documents. And then farmers can export their certifications using the data that they had already entered. So really trying to make this process much easier. So this is just kind of the user flow, which I can talk about later if people are interested. And then here's some photos of just in the field. So this is our Brazilian group, some of their work, training farmers to enter their own data, where all of the groups offered youth internships. So there was kind of youth helpers that were going around and helping people, especially because we had quite widely varying levels of digital literacy among the pilot group. And so having a youth intern from the local community to help farmers kind of navigate the digital platform was quite enriching. And it was really interesting to see kind of, it's not just technical assistance that these youth were providing, they're also now kind of sharing agricultural techniques with each other. And that was kind of fun to see. With just some more photos from some of the systems we're working with in Brazil. We finally got back to the field this spring, so I was able to go, which is really fun. And then I'll just quickly walk you through some of the figures from this first round of digital data entry that the farmers themselves did, and then we can maybe save some time for questions. So just a few of the indicators that we're kind of extracting from the digital platform. So things like, okay, farmers are mapping their farms, and they're telling us, how much of their plot do they have in active cultivation, how much might be in a natural area, what is their home plate of their, buildings and other installations, how many greenhouses do they have. So we have really quite explicit spatial data on the composition of the farm landscape. So this is just a figure that shows the proportion of the farm that's in a natural area. And you can see this varies super widely. So the Brazilian group, where Brazil has laws on how much, Brazilian small farms are actually quite large, but the Brazilian government has agricultural zoning in place, which means a certain percent of the farm has to remain in a natural area. But you can see not all the Brazilian farms have natural area. So that's interesting. And then, so some farms are quite small. So the El Salvador farms are pretty small. The Mexico farms are pretty small. The Brazilian farms, CIMMYT, Sapagro, and MMV are all much larger. So this is crop diversity. So this is the number of distinct varieties grown on each farm. So you can see that the average number of distinct crop varieties per farm in this group in Brazil was 46, and the other Brazilian group 40. So you can see these farms are quite diverse. Where's MMV? So this group in Brazil, CIMMYT, is in southern Brazil. I don't know where and so they're less diverse. So they're more commodity-oriented farmers. So you can just start to see amongst the different groups these patterns of things like crop diversity on the farm. So we have a two parts to the application. One is a data entry in our open source platform, and we've linked up with an open source survey platform where farmer groups can put in their own set of questions. And so our first year we did a questionnaire on what agroecological practices the different farmers are using. And so this is a slide that I'm not going to go through, but we looked at soil practices, biodiversity practices, and other practices related to agroecology as defined by our farmer network. And you can see the differences amongst the different groups of farmers and the level of use of this technology. And so then we start to say, well, what might explain these differences? And things like, well, obviously, if your land is flat, you don't need a terrace, or, if you're using, burning, almost none of the farmers were burning, which is interesting, which is a practice that's been, worked a lot. There's been a lot of extension around not burning fields. So we're kind of digging back into this data now to try to explain, well, what is the context specificity of these differences in agroecological practices? What are the social, economic, policy contexts that might shape the use of certain practices over others? So we also looked at diversity according to our more holistic view of what agroecological transitions are. We looked at diversity in marketing and marketing channels. So most of these farmers are selling to local markets, CSA baskets or farmers markets. Quite a few of them were actually doing food processing, having their own stores. This is sharing and bartering. So a lot of the farmers, again, are when we think about agricultural census data, a lot of times we're covering just simply what goes into the market. And so we're able to see that a lot of what these farmers are growing is going back to their own livestock, it's going to bartering, it's going to self-consumption. So autoconsumo would be what is consumed on the farm itself. We asked about challenges to agroecological transitions. Labor was the biggest challenge for all the groups. Diversified farms, diversification is labor intensive often. And so understanding what labor opportunities or challenges farmers have and what are some ways to save labor or reduce labor without reducing diversity is top of mind for a lot of these groups. Consumer markets were both a challenge, but then as you'll see, they are also being considered as an opportunity to support diversification. There was quite a bit of desire for more technical assistance, input substitution, better understanding the management practices associated with agroecology. And just to, one comment, for this initial pilot group, all of these farmers had been certified for at least 3 years. So these were not farmers in transition or new. We decided for this first round really to look at farmers who had already decided to transition, they were already certified, and then to see, what are their challenges for staying the course or scaling up and out. We looked at gender relations. This was something that was quite of interest to all the groups. Who's doing work on the farm? How are decisions made? And so this is something that the farmer groups have taken back to their constituents and they're discussing. It's been quite interesting to hear the feedback from this data. We asked about family succession and involvement of youth. So we found that, almost half of the farms didn't have youth on the farm. So we're seeing an aging in the countryside across the board. Of the 60% of farms that did have youth on the farm, 75% of those youth did want to stay farming. And so really kind of entering into that pathway of what is it going to take to keep youth on the land? Things need to change on the farm. What are the youth interested in? They're interested in sustainability. They're interested in local markets. They're interested in social networking. And so really thinking about how agroecology can attract and maintain family succession has been another interesting and unexpected direction that this project has taken. So this is another kind of deep dive into youth, looking at the degree of participation and empowerment of youth. So youth are involved. They don't have a financial autonomy. They don't have much decision making, but they are quite involved in social networks. So lessons learned. Digital literacy is a challenge, especially for older farmers. One farmer commented, it's like learning another language. Some farmers, especially the older ones, didn't have an email address. The minimum for entering into the digital platform is you have to have an email address. And so youth were, creating Gmail accounts for farmers so they could be the owners of their own accounts. But again, this is a process of a totally different way of communicating. Rural bandwidth is a challenge. You know, most people, we did a survey on access to technology. Almost 100% of the farms had access to a device, whether they owned it or their relative owned it. Almost 100% of the farms had access to the internet, either in their own household or in a community center or at a neighbor. But bandwidth was a challenge. If you're out in the field, you might not have access to the internet. And that's a challenge even in Canada. It's a challenge for many, many farms globally. Even if you have access to the internet somewhere, you might not have access in your field. And so we're working with, we're trying to reduce the use of field notebooks, but there are still some things that are being entered into field notebooks and then entered into the app, you know, in the kitchen. We're also working on some aspects of the app have offline capacity, and that's an area that we're investing in this next couple of years. Data governance is a challenge for scaling up. So we did a couple data governance workshops in the last couple months. Farmers own their own data, it's in their own account. They're sharing it with their technicians. This is, you know, we've done a lot of interviews saying, are farmers concerned about this? And the answers we're getting is it's based on a relationship of trust, that farmers have been sharing data with certifying technicians for some years. Just because it's digital, that doesn't seem to bother them. What is of concern is scaling up more broadly. So sharing data with the government, or being concerned about databases being hacked, or that sort of thing. And so another piece was, these are farmers that have been certified for several years. They've kind of overcome that relational challenge of trust. Talking about scaling up, you know, one technician said to me this week, you know, it takes a couple of years of conversation before a new farmer might, you know, actually agree to be certified, even in the old paper form network. And especially younger farmers actually are more concerned about data governance than the older farmers. I think younger farmers who are in social networking, who understand hacking, they're more concerned about using digital technology than the older ones are like, sure, it's just another way to share data. So that's been interesting. And we've been exploring different ways to, you know, protect the data. Obviously, that's always been top of mind, but also ways to communicate protocols for data governance that can be farmer driven. And then the last thing is the consumers have power. So this is a cooperative in Tlaxcala that sells organic wheat and corn, and they are selling it to generally restaurants and special bakeries who want this kind of certified. And they said, well, you know, our most recent buyer said she would buy all of our production if she could, you know, be able to follow along the production process. And they're like, can we use the app for that? And I said, sure, of course you can. This is your decision on who you share your data with. But this kind of traceability is of increasing importance to consumers. And so farmers who are able and interested in sharing data about their production processes with their buyers are finding that that's a way to get a better price for their product. So they are getting quite a bit better price for their maize and their wheat, because they're using this direct marketing relationship where they're able to share data with their buyer. And then finally, digital knowledge networks have power. So it's been really interesting to observe how this data is being used by the organizations. They're creating webinars, they're creating infographics, they're creating news stories, you know, kind of in real time. Whereas maybe before, I might have a master's student who goes and does research, and then a couple of years later, their paper comes out, and then the community sort of summary goes out. It might take years or never for sometimes researchers don't take data back to the farm. These farmer networks are having access to data in real time, and they're putting it out there, you know, and we're like, whoa, there's another article about our project, which we had no idea, you know, there's our data right there. And so that's been really interesting from a data sovereignty perspective. Future directions, we're still doing work on harmonizing agroecological certification form outputs. So, you know, there's a technical piece to that, but then there's also kind of a decision making, what if we're going to invest in a generic form, what's in and what's out. And so we have we've kind of narrowed down into kind of what are the most common things that all farmers are interested in. And then the part B, the questionnaires, farmer groups can change the questions themselves. And so we kind of have a technical way to link the standard question, the standard output form with the question set that farmer groups decide for themselves. And we have some common question sets that farmers can choose from if they want, but they can also add their own. We're working on improving indicator tracking for labor, for yield, estimated versus actual. So that's been a real interesting thing on yield. The management plans ask farmers estimated yield, but for certification, farmers don't have to report on what their actual yield was. And from a research perspective, we're interested in actual yield and where that yield goes. And so we did a campaign this year, and many of the farmers that we're working with don't track yield. That wasn't part of, they might go harvest something and they might sell it, and they might keep the receipt from the sale, but they're not necessarily tracking the full spectrum of their yield. And so we have some pilot groups that have committed to tracking all their yield from certain plots for a year. And so that data is starting to roll in. We have an integration with iNaturalist. So any iNaturalist biodiversity observation in a farm parcel, we can collect that data really easily. And so we've been working on an agricultural BioBlitz curriculum to train, especially youth who are interested in this, to go and do BioBlitz campaigns on the farm, so we can have a better sense of not just the agrobiodiversity, but the total biodiversity on a given farm, and then start to maybe do some analysis on the relationship between agrobiodiversity, landscape composition, and natural biodiversity. Doing some more work on youth and gender assessment. And we're working on, we've just done our first data sharing agreement with an external researcher who is going to analyze some of the initial labor data. And so that's been a really exciting way to build our analytical capacity on the research side. Yeah, so that's all I have to present, but I'm super happy to take questions. And thanks for having me.
There is no. Thank you very much, Hannah. Really interesting, the combination of participatory certification and digital technologies, because normally the participatory certification is very, very local, very based on trust. And when you put the digital element between the two, that trust needs to be really strengthened, because it can be lost, because then it becomes farmer with an app, consumer with information that is not close to that. I don't know if there is any question here. Simon?
Thanks for the presentation. I find it very impressive, this application. We've been trying to work with applications where we take actually a lot of farm data in our experimental fields, but not really in a very user-friendly way. And what you're showing me, it looks much more user-friendly, much more easy. You can convince farmers to put in data. That must mean that it's a relatively fun system to work with. So I was wondering, how did you develop that? How did it come to be? You said you did a hackathon kind of thing, but
yeah, it was farmer driven. So again, my group is not a digital group. We are ethnographers, we are qualitative researchers, and what we were hearing from farmers is they were interested in technology, but it wasn't working for them. And so we had a series of grants where we hired UI UX people who interviewed farmers. My postdoc interviewed farmers, my grad students interviewed farmers. We had quite a long period of interviewing on, what was an interface that was user-friendly, that was accessible, that was easy to download, didn't use a lot of bandwidth. And that's been a very iterative process. So what you see today does not look like what you saw 2 years ago. We have user feedback sessions every month where the farmers, it's kind of just a session. We have one in Spanish and one in Portuguese, and we have them in English from time to time as well, where whoever wants to show up can show up on Zoom. They can say everything they like and don't like about the app. And there's lots of things they don't like. And then we kind of say, okay, where are the common pain points, and how much money do we have to hire developers to fix those pain points? And it's been that iterative process. So user feedback has been the number one way that we've tried to fix this. I think many apps are created by people who see a need for something and then they go and recruit participants to try it. And ours was the opposite. The needs came first, and then we designed for those needs. And so I think that's maybe one of the reasons that it is user-friendly, because it's not into, I mean, I did grow up farming, so I have some knowledge of that, but I've worked with farmers my whole career, but our computer scientists have never worked with farmers. You know, it's been interesting, like even on a vocabulary basis, how do we, agricultural systems are so complex and they're so context specific. How do we translate that into something that works for the most amount of people? And so that's been a really interesting conversation too. We've been actually hiring contract developers from other countries, and having an agricultural background or having a relative who farms, or, you know, that's been one of our recruitment criteria, that even if you're a computer scientist, you need to know what agriculture is. And so that's been interesting as well. Yeah.
Any other questions? No questions yet in the, if not,
Comment from Shamin Ara. Very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you so much.
well, I have a couple of questions, two questions. One is, well, there are many apps around, right? Actually, I was involved with CIMMYT in the development of tape, and then they developed an app. I haven't actually seen the app. I'm not very techie myself, so I did the background part, and I know they developed an app, which it went into application all over the planet. So I want to know the interoperability of these apps. How can we, as scientists, you have 3,000 IDs, 3,000 farms that you have put the details of the farm there. Tape must have 15,000 farms. Romi's Rural Household Surveys has 50,000.
Yeah.
Do you think one day how easy it can be that we can start putting, because one of the advantages of these digital technologies is that we should be able to put these things together.
Yeah.
So what is your view into this interoperability between the different apps?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we've been talking over the years quite a lot with the TAPE team. It's been a little while, but my last understanding of the TAPE app is it's still a proprietary census app where a paid enumerator goes and interviews and characterizes a farm and takes that data and puts it in the FAO database. So it's a much improved census compared to the every 10 years census, but it's designed as a census, not as a management tool. And so our approach is that farmers are managing their own farms and they are maintaining their own data for their own purposes. And they may be willing to allow a researcher or a certification group to harvest that data. So it's a very different starting point. As far as interoperability goes, we have our kind of proposal that could happen is we've mapped what our app tracks against the TAPE indicators, and we cover about half at this point. All of the rest can be included in the questionnaire. So it would be quite easy if a TAPE enumerator was to use the platform to do the TAPE questionnaire, that our principle is that the farmer has to agree to that, and the farmer then owns their own data. So in this case, a farmer would agree to create an account in Light Farm. They would characterize their farm in Light Farm. They would answer the TAPE questions once, the remaining questions, but they would remain with access to that data and the ability to manage their farm using the application after the enumerator leaves. So it's a different kind of way. It's totally technically possible. Data governance is an issue is top of mind. How is that data stored? Who owns it? But yeah, it's totally possible.
Yeah, perfect. I think it's possible, and I think all these apps, they come into light for different purposes.
Yeah.
You know? So the tape was more trying to generate evidence at the global level
Mhm,
to influence FAO
mhm.
to put up policies related to agroecology, but we needed evidence at the global level, which is very different from providing participatory certification or even farm management advice as other apps. But
Yeah.
I can also imagine that this digital era would allow us to start putting hundreds of thousands of data together to start looking at
Yeah.
big populations of farms and their agroecological transition. And the other question is about as a researcher, I am very interested in trade-offs and trade-off analysis between different objectives and indicators and how different management practices contribute to one or another indicator in a synergy or in a trade-off. How far have you been able to do that with the app and the number of farms you have now? I guess we used to do trade-offs at the farm level, one farm, trying to model one farm, but also at the farm population level. So we have thousands of farms and we can start seeing some generic trends in terms of trade-offs or synergies. How is the trade-off and synergy analysis going on with your agroecological?
We're just starting. So one of the analyses that we've just now cleaned the data set and have a couple of researchers working on it is the trade-off between, farm size, level of diversification, and labor intensity. So knowing that labor is a known constraint, we're looking at things like, how diverse is your farm, both in the number of things that you're growing, but also spatially, how diverse is it? Is your farm spread out or is it consolidated? So we have a couple of researchers in our group who are interested in landscape composition and trying to look at trade-offs between, farm size, field size, diversification level, labor intensity, for example. We need to do trade-off analyses on income versus diversity. We need to do trade-off analyses on all kinds of things, all kinds of things. But that's the idea, that once we get these larger data sets, you can start to do that kind of analysis. And so because it's an open data project, we're super interested if people are interested in joining the team and taking off pieces and sharing. Yeah.
Any other question?
There is one more question here. Thanks for the great presentation. Public and private actors are critical in the transition to more agroecological farming. You mentioned issues of data security. How do you see responsible use of the data to enable other actors in the system leverage the farmer data to accelerate the transition?
That's a great question. From what we're understanding from the people who are participating in our project, their first principle is having control over their own data and sharing it with actors that they choose. And so what they're interested in sharing is, they say, we want to show that agroecology is profitable. We want to show that agroecology is, protecting biodiversity. We want to show that agroecology is contributing to climate mitigation. And so they're really interested in having the synthesis done, and they want to share them with their local policymakers. They want to share them with national governments to push public programs and public financing more in the area of this kind of sustainable agriculture that they believe works. And just, one example, we were in Brazil this spring and we were kind of doing a feedback session with the team and the farmer groups. And, they invited members of the Municipal Secretary of Agriculture to come to the session. So, we didn't know this was happening. And they said, and the municipal government was like, wow, this is great data. And they asked me, can you give me the data? And I said, well, no, of course I can't give you the data, but you can talk to your farmers here. And if they want to share the data with you, they can. And so I think governments are not used to going to farmers themselves for data. They receive information in a really mediated way. And I think that kind of partial access to the reality of local farming conditions has been limiting for public policy. So the extent to which farmers can share a more fulsome narrative about their experiences and about their needs and about their contributions, I think that can only help public policy.
Good. Well, I think we are over time now. I want to thank you very much, Hannah, for the presentation. I think it contributes to a new area in CIMMYT related to agroecology. No? I think we are really transitioning as well ourselves as an institution towards more agroecological systems. And I think this is the kind of presentations and inputs we need as an institution to move towards this kind of agricultural systems with more respect for the environment, that remain sustained or remain productive, but that they decrease the environmental impact and the social injustice that many systems have created. Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you, everybody.
For having me. Thank all of you who are with us online as well.
Thanks.